Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the mid-afternoon session of Day 2 of Open Book Cape Town, and to the third and final session, which forms part of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, which we have been co-hosting over the last 2 days, together with the Edinburgh International Book Festival and, of course, the British Council. This afternoon, we are very, very happy to have ANJALI Joseph to deliver the keynote address on the subject you see behind you, or behind me, in front of you rather, in national literature. To introduce ANJALI and to chair the session, I'd really like to welcome Imraan Coovadia. Imraan is the author of 4 novels, and most recently a collection of essays which has just come out called Transformations, and he's going to be in discussion with Neil Stevenson over the weekend at Open Book, who also has a new collection of essays out. Imraan's first novel was The Wedding, and he followed that up with Green-Eyed Thieves. After that came Hilo in Between, which scooped just about every literary award in South Africa for good reason. And he's just recently published Institute for Taxi Poetry, which came out about 3-4 months ago. So he's one of that rare breed of writers who manages to get 2 books onto the bookshelves in a space of about 3 months. But because we are such fans of his writing, we're very happy about that. It's a good thing, not a bad thing. This is not a James Patterson moment, it's an Imraan Coovadia moment. So please welcome Imraan Coovadia. Thank you very much.
Thanks. ANJALI Joseph is of my school of biography or autobiography, which says that as few words should be attached to a writer as possible before you listen to them. And I've read the text of her address, and we're going to be talking about it, all of us together, and myself and ANJALI for some time. And can you hear me, by the way? Yeah? And in that address, you'll see her kind of distinctive, questioning, skeptical way of thinking, but her kind of persuasive way of holding to the requirements of the imagination, which I think is the common thread in both of her novels. She was born in Bombay, and she is, as they say, an award-winning writer, always leaving out which awards which really count, but in her case, she's won several really big ones, including, is it the Betty Trusk Award, and some kind of crossword award. I didn't realize that you were good at crosswords.
Anyway, yeah, very good at
okay.
crosswords, yes.
Skeptical crossword awards. She's the author of 2 very interesting novels. Saraswati Park was her first novel, and a few months ago, her second novel, Another Country, came out. Please welcome ANJALI Joseph.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to listen to this and take part in this. The talk's titled A National Literature, Reading and Writing Across Boundaries. Can you hear me properly, by the way? Yep. When I saw the title of this talk, A National Literature, I felt mildly depressed. It was an involuntary reaction, kind of like the way one feels when made to fit in a form and categorize oneself, nationality, country of residence, address, that sort of thing. I immediately felt alienated at the idea of a national literature, and I don't think this was just because I'm an expatriate Indian who lives in England. The idea of a national literature sounded massive, like the kind of entity that would have a minister or an advisory committee and a big white building somewhere with a security guard, and I immediately felt national literature has got nothing to do with me. Or maybe it could have been something that I would have read in a classroom somewhere, but not something that reflected my experience. And straight after that slightly rebellious feeling, I had another thought. I remembered an image from a novel first published in 1928 in Bengali. This is from Pathe Panchali by Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay. The title of the novel translates as something like Song of the Road, and it was made into a famous film by Satyajit Ray. It's about the life of a young boy named Apu and his sister, and they live in a village in rural Bengal at the turn of the 20th century. They come from a poor family and they play in the forest around the village, or near the river. I'm going to read a short passage in English translation from the novel. Just before this passage happens, Apu's father has subscribed to a magazine called Bongo Boshi for them, and this is exciting because there are serialized stories in the magazine. So the passage begins when Apu and his friend have gone out onto the river in a small boat, and they realize that an enormous storm is about to break. He could think of nothing but the storm. His body was tense, his eyes staring straight ahead, now at the sky, now at the waves that rushed down upon them. The water danced wildly. The paddy birds were flying. The cloud mountains writhed in convulsions. And on the bank, he could see the heaps of shells that the boatmen from the south had piled up. A floating island of water hyacinth swept by, so wide that it hid the water from sight. Suddenly, he was voyaging to England like that man in the Bongoboshi. His ship had sailed from Calcutta. Sagar Island in the mouth of the estuary was behind them, and they were threading their way through a host of little islands in the middle of the sea. The dark green line of coconut palms on the shore of Ceylon was already in sight, and on the far horizon he could make out blue mountains in a strange land, which reddened as he watched them in the light of the setting sun. Everything was different, new lands, new sights, and still he journeyed on, further and further, into the unknown. Now, Apu has an incredibly responsive imagination, and whenever he reads, the things that he reads become a part of the place where he lives, even though they're set somewhere quite different. So the river on which he and his friend are boating is a distributary of other larger rivers that lead to the Ganga and then to the sea. And there's a way in which Apu's reading also opens him out to a much wider world than he would otherwise have known. His story is the story of a village boy reading serial novels and daydreaming of the world. And it's told in a serial novel which becomes a famous film which is seen all over the world. So there's a kind of two-way movement here. I didn't grow up in a village in turn-of-the-century Bengal, but this extract feels very close to me. I think that's because there's something universal in it, which is the experience of what it's like to read and find what you read weaving itself into the texture of your daily life. There's a way in which perhaps each of us at any time has his or her own internal cry or thing that has to be expressed, even if that isn't articulated in words. In Gerard Manley Hopkins' sonnet, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, the poet says of each mortal thing, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. And in the same way, when we read, perhaps we're looking for an answering echo of this cry in the world, and reading to receive messages from the world. Sometimes we read to go on a journey and be someone else, while still remaining ourselves. And a book can be like the magical flying carpet in the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. So the idea of reading feels close to me, but the idea of literature feels a little bit abstract, as in fact the idea of a nation feels abstract. These notions seem more static and fixed, even congealed. When we talk of a nation and literature and national literature, we're talking about classes of things. This type of man, an Indian, a South African. We move away from lived experience and into the generic. In fact, we become like some of the famous bores in fiction, like Polonius in Hamlet, or Monsieur Homais the chemist in Madame Bovary, people who deal with generalizations. Writers don't only read their national literatures, they form affiliations and links of choice with the writers that they have read who matter to them. So that could mean that a French novelist like Claude Simon is reading William Faulkner, or a South African novelist like Coetzee is reading Samuel Beckett, or there's an Indian writer reading Yasunari Kawabata. And these links matter far more than the vertical lineage of nationality. Perhaps the label literature has a slightly defensive aspect. Perhaps it's intended to validate or protect work that might not have an immediate appeal to everyone. Suppose that I like reading and a friend gives me a book, and I open it and read this. To one on his back in the dark, a voice tells of a past, with occasional allusion to a present, and more rarely to a future, as, for example, you will end as you now are, and in another dark, or in the same, another, devising it all for company. Quick, leave him. And suppose after reading this, I actually feel a little bit upset, as though I want to cry, because I can't see the story, or the characters, or anything that I'm expecting, and I say to my friend who gave me the book, I don't get it, I thought you said this was a really good book. And she says, well, it's by Samuel Beckett and it's literature. Maybe then, I'd actually carry on reading the book, and maybe in its very strangeness, I would find something that makes me see my own experience in a way that rings true to me, but which I otherwise wouldn't have perceived, something that actually brings me home to myself. Because I think it's a myth that inside we experience ourselves in a linear way, like a 19th century novel or a Hollywood film, a straightforward sequence of cause and effect, where you do something good and then later you have a piece of good fortune. Maybe sometimes it feels like that, but very often it doesn't. And I think this is the great adventure of the modernist novel, to create an image of this soup that we spend our time in, of which is made up of memory and thought and desire and urges and advertising and the internet and newspapers and television and sex, and actually give us back this image so that we can recognize it and for a moment be liberated from it. There's nothing stranger than a human being. Sometimes there's nothing stranger than oneself. And sometimes these different varieties of strangeness seem quite hermetically contained, quite sealed, each inside its casing, walking around or issuing messages through the ether, through the internet, or in print. it's a small miracle when these messages transmit and are received. And reading and writing are two of the most discreet, tactful, and beautiful ways in which it's possible for a human being in a landscape to think to himself, I'm here, and then feel lonely and listen and ask, is anyone else there? Can you hear me? Finding a book and opening it is to realize in a satisfying internal way, there is someone else there. And it's a way for a writer to sit in a room and write something and wonder, am I mad? Does this exist? And for the words that represent her thoughts to be printed and later found in a book by someone else in another country, and for the message to arrive home. And I think the operation of that basic magic is why literature and reading matter to us, and why we respond to them. But I think that has very little to do with national boundaries. Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali. So I thought I would talk to Anjali and ask her some questions, and then if anyone feels particularly moved to interject, and then we'll get to other questions later. Okay. But Margie, you can talk anytime you like. I suppose I was taking some notes on my cell phone, having left my pen behind. In fact, I don't think I own a pen anymore. It struck me that one of our professional tasks as writers is to have second thoughts, and then second thoughts about the second thoughts, so that maybe we could run through some of them. Listening to what you're saying, it struck me that there's kind of, I mean, in a practical way, any writer knows this, that when a book is published, there's a kind of battle for a few weeks to assign a meaning to that book, you know, and then if the book lives, you know, there's a kind of the academics battle, first the critics battle to assign a meaning to it, and then after a few months or years, the academics start to assign a meaning to it of some kind or another. And what you're talking about is the process of assigning a national meaning to a book.
Right.
Or reading it inside a nation, right? Has that happened to you? I mean, is that how Saraswati Park was read?
It's happened to me in a very small way, but it wasn't particularly, you know, it didn't have a great impact on me. But I think I object to it more when it happens to writers whose work I really like. You know, if I read in a review that this or that thing doesn't reflect the real India, for example, or it does reflect the real India. I mean, I thought the whole notion of a real India is a tiresome one, I think. But for example, that kind of thing really upsets me when I think it's simplified and sort of traduced things that I really care about.
Do you think that as a writers, I mean, as writers, we tend to find anything said about our books simplifying by nature. And is it part of our kind of magic to that we're allowed to use that argument, that I mean, I think you're absolutely right, that life is much more complex and kind of fleeting and fantastical than actually even appears on the page, and certainly in the newspapers. But do you have any misgivings about that argument of complexity? Because readers, by and large, don't like complexity. They love books of different kinds, sometimes complicated books, but they want simple arguments about what those books are about when they exchange them with each other.
Well, I think there's a way in which, a bit like when a new record comes out by a band that you love, that there's a way in which there's a sort of first hearing, and you know, like the reviews would talk about how this album compares to their last album and what the songs are like and how good it is. But there's a way in which you listen to it over and over and you live with it for a while, and then it kind of means something different to you. And I think books often have a similar life.
Okay.
But I don't know if that experience as a reader is really explained in any fruitful way by just categories of national literature.
Okay. Do you think people are just uncomfortable living with the strangeness and unpredictability of the kinds of books that you write and the kinds of books that you care about, without tucking them into
me personally?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I think readers aren't that prescriptive about these things. People who make syllabuses and you know, organize culture in a more directed way maybe are more.
There's a kind of intellectual class struggle between writers and the organizers of culture, really. On the one hand, we're dependent on them. On the other hand, we can't bear what they say about it, right? Roughly. You said that we do two things when we're reading. We read for elsewhere and we read to come home. Who do you read for elsewhere?
Who do I read for elsewhere? That's a good question.
Is Calvino someone you read for elsewhere or for a home?
I've only read one of his books all the way through, Invisible Cities, but I did really like that. I don't know, I think I'd read for a sort of combination of strangeness and home.
Sure.
Yeah.
And there's something in the kind of mixture of them that makes a book great.
Yeah. I think there's a way in which you can read and sort of think, no, 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 I can't deal with this. And then by the end, you know, if it's been skillfully done, you think, oh, actually, yes, this tells me something about myself. And the book that I remember reading recently that made me feel like that was a book called A Russian Novel. It's a French novel by a writer called Emmanuel Carrère. And it's about this...
the guy who wrote The Adversary.
Possibly. And it's about a character who's very like him and who's making this documentary about Jews in Russia and in, I think, Poland. And then it's also this story of him and how he kind of hatches this really bizarre escapade with his girlfriend in France, where he's going to write an erotic story and publish it in Le Monde newspaper. And she's taking this train journey, and he's told her to buy the newspaper and read it on the train. And the story involves his and her erotic experiences on the train. And his plan is that he'll get on at a specific station, and he's sort of driving from Paris or wherever to meet the fast train, get on the train, walk through, find her, and then, you know, in real life have a culmination of this whole experience. So the story appears in Le Monde, but unfortunately his girlfriend cancels the journey at the last minute, and it later turns out that she's been having a relationship with somebody else. So that's a kind of whole big thing of part of the story as well. And he seems like this incredibly narcissistic, not particularly pleasant man. But there's a real honesty in his gaze, and more things unfold in the book. And by the end of it, I really felt like I've learned something about myself in a way, despite at the beginning and much of the way through the book kind of feeling quite repelled by it.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we were just in one of my seminars this week. We were talking about Henry James and the way in which the characters in Portrait of a Lady are simultaneously, they're very ceremonial and ritualistic about, you know, whatever it is, having tea, meeting people and stuff. And yet there's a kind of odd transparency you feel about them, and it's unclear why they're allowed to be transparent, whereas often characters in African novels who are similarly ritualistic or ceremonial don't seem to have transparency conferred upon them. Can I ask you something? You know, South Africans are natural Marxists because we know that everyone has real interests beneath what they say and are pursuing them. Writers obviously have certain professional interest, right, in asserting the autonomy of our subject matter. We don't want anyone choosing to tell us that we're really write about structuralist codes or political oppression, and we don't want anyone curtailing our freedom of expression for obvious reasons. How about readers? I mean, part of what you're talking about is the nature of reading, and I think it's really interesting. I was staying with my parents in Durban, so it might be a little different in Cape Town, but I went to the public library in Umhlanga, which is a kind of seaside town outside of Durban, and I looked at the cart of books that people were returning that day, because most libraries have that cart where you can just pick up the books that have just come back. And I tried to categorize what they were, and they were basically either thriller novels or romance novels,
right,
with a tiny number of other novels. I don't know if maybe there was a novel of Damon's in there somewhere, I'm not sure, or Diane's, but basically I thought people are reading these novels for the same dubious reasons that they look and watch at other things, watch thriller movies or read pornography or whatever it is. They're kind of certain slightly suspicious desires that are being perpetuated by these kinds of novels. So should we let readers off as easily as we're doing?
How are we letting them off? How do you mean?
By not thinking that their own desires to read novels are as suspicious as our desires to write them, or critics' desires to control their meanings.
I think that they're not really suspicious. They're just very simple. I mean, it's a kind of simple wish fulfillment, isn't it? And what makes it boring, or at least reliable in the case of a romance novel or something, is that it has a very specific arc, just like a Hollywood film does. So it's masturbatory in a sense, because it's always going to get to a certain end,
sure.
But but at least hopefully. But I don't think that makes it bad. I mean, it's like eating fast food or whatever. It's a certain repetitive pleasure. Maybe if you didn't read anything else, it would be depressing. Ever.
But is that the kind of dividing line between kind of interesting literary novels and not very interesting novels, that in interesting literary novels we have indirect forms of wish fulfillment, and in kind of ordinary novels or junk novels you have direct wish fulfillment? Maybe, yeah. Okay. The prince on his horse sweeps in and notices no one but you. Let me ask you my second set of thoughts, which is, on the one hand, I think everybody in this room is completely with you in simultaneously denying the explanatory power of the nation as a kind of unit, as a kind of category of interpretation, as well as accepting the kind of inevitability of it, that it will keep recurring in different ways. But Someone said to me a few years ago, everything is about context, and I completely denied it at the time. But I thought I'd say something about the South African context. All of us in South Africa, almost all of us, have to in some way deal with the phenomenon of Coetzee as writers, if we're not going to be completely flattened by it. And I've been kind of trying to rethink it myself. And it struck me that the thing about Coetzee is he invented a kind of version of...
Do you have anxiety dreams about him?
Not really, no. No. Not about John himself. Maybe about the Coetzeeans, who terrify me. But I think they're the ones who have anxiety dreams more than anything. But Coetzee invented or elaborated a kind of international style. In the same way that there's a kind of international style of architecture, there's a kind of international style of prose. And Tim Parks has been talking about this in the New York Review of Books at the same time. Or in the same way that, we kind of reject academic prose because it has that same mechanical quality. Do you have any reservations about the international style, like the post-national kind of way of writing literature to join other kinds of literatures around the world?
How would you characterize the international style?
I think, Parks's essays have been really interesting about this. Partly it's a certain sort of purification of the local so that it fits into certain ideas of what literature is at the international level. So that, there's different kinds of work about this. There's Pascal Casanova's work about what's acceptable in Paris in literature becomes what's acceptable as global literature. There's certain kind of filters of literature. Do you think that style exists, or am I imagining it? Do you have reservations about the kind of audiences your books reach, or do you feel that they don't belong to that kind of style?
I don't know if they do belong. I haven't read the essay, so I don't know enough about this contention, but I don't know if they do belong to that style. But I wonder if that's true of Coetzee. Tim Parks is such a good essayist. I'm sure that it's a really persuasive argument. But international, what does that mean? Or is it just related to the fact that the things that Coetzee reads and rereads are certain authors, French authors or people writing in French or whatever, and English in a certain way, and therefore that's the sort of lexical field of his novels? I don't know.
No, I think that's absolutely true. But I guess in a South African context, it sometimes seems like a progressive or even unexpected thing to say what people said in the 19th century, or in the 18th century, which is that part of the great source of interesting artworks is reality, observation of reality, and kind of connection to it. And it seems like with Coetzee and with the kind of the international style, if Tim Parks is right about its existence, we've reached a kind of point of kind of too much purification from
abstraction. Well, it's interesting because in India we have a similar, not the international style, but we have this kind of debate endlessly about the authenticity of, especially writing by Indian writers, but in English, because writers who write in Indian languages other than English feel annoyed that their work gets less international attention and makes less money, which is completely legitimate. And then critics also just have this strange position about authenticity, where I don't know either. If you write a novel that closely observes daily life in India, it's been my experience that people get really angry and they say, "But this is just kind of rubbish, and it's like my daily life, and this isn't a book," and they accuse you of being inauthentic and quote unquote writing for a Western audience, which is kind of the terrible thing that you can't ever do. And yet they'll read and review novels that have relentlessly exotic things happening, grandmothers making pickles and telling endless stories, elephants, magic things appearing or whatever, and that complaint is never made. And maybe I just have lived in the wrong places, but that's never been a part of my daily life when I've lived in India. So
no, I have a personal crusade against any novel with a young white woman protagonist which has crocodiles in it and is set in Southern Africa and generally has a naive black servant who somehow is in touch with the deeper realities of the cosmos. But that's the easiest way to make $1 million, if any of you are worried about it, is to write a novel with that protagonist. We have our own kind of kitsch, and I guess India has its own kind of international kitsch in a way.
Yes, but if you sort of break those rules, then oddly enough, people feel quite annoyed about it.
No, it's odd. I think you're absolutely right about that phenomenon. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the role of kind of Indian writers in that, because I think you're absolutely right to pick on it. On the one hand, Indian writers seem to be carried as far as the English language goes and almost be comfortable in any English language society. On the other hand, it seems that many Indian novels are appreciated so much because they have this kind of intense version of the local or the regional or the particular, which seems to have been lost in Western Europe or the United States. Do you think it's a fair way to read them, and do you see that in your own writing or not?
I think it's turned into a bit of a brand on occasion, that the type of Indian literature that's available in the West and publicized in the West. So sometimes people are looking for their kind of familiar hit of like, but where was the grandmother with the pickles, you know, or the elephant or whatever. So is it actually the stuff of somebody, you know, not necessarily somebody like the author, but someone's daily experience? I don't know, possibly. Or is it just another form of this was the thing that I was expecting and this is the thing that I wanted kind of urge? I don't know. But I know that, you know, India strikes me as a parallel for South Africa because we're, 60 years old as a country, and there is this same sense of what... Of thinking about literature as a kind of nation-building thing and almost a kind of don't let the school down feeling sometimes, which obviously lots of people have rebelled against.
Sure.
And it's also interesting that there are some writers in English, for example, in India, who do incredibly well in India. For example, a person called Upamanyu Chatterjee, who wrote English August and other books, and who aren't particularly read or known of outside India, even if they're published outside. So that's kind of, you know, strange.
Yeah, the kind of the role of kind of different audiences in shaping what writing works. In fact, if that's something that I feel like readers don't really know about writers, which is that, I mean, if you look, for example, at Thomas Hardy's career, his first book is a kind of, you know, it's Hardy, the kind of the great novelist of the kind of English working classes and stonemasons and carpenters and obscure, you know, provincial intellectuals. His first book is a kind of drawing room comedy. But in it, I think in his first book, there were kind of a couple pages about poor people, and people really liked those few pages, and then he essentially based the rest of his writing career on writing on what had struck a chord.
Right.
Are there things that have happened to you? I mean, when you published Saraswati Park or before that, were there kind of really unexpected reactions that you resisted or found interesting?
You mean, for example, being praised for something that that it wouldn't strike you? Maybe. I can't remember. I think it was more, I remember more of especially in India, this kind of, you know, but this is just like my daily life outrage.
Sure.
Yeah. Which I thought was such a strange criticism.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it does. Well, I mean, maybe people don't like their daily lives.
Obviously, yeah.
Should we open the floor to some questions, yeah? Okay. Who's going to be the first to ask a question? Margie, you must have a question or comment.
The idea of a national literature, it seems to me, if you look at the history of national literatures in Africa, for instance, that you have a fantasy of the nation before it's actually achieved. So in the independence struggle, there's, you know, leading up, there's a lot about writing towards this fantasy of nation. And then the moment of independence happens, and then immediately the idea of the nation is dispersed because there is nothing coherent or binding. So it's often, you know, in the developing world, it's as though, or the post-colonial world, it's as though the nation is this imaginary state that you write towards until it happens politically, and then it disappears again. And sometimes a national literature, it seems to me, more and more allocated to literature that's about a kind of cultural tourism or poverty tourism or kind of anthropological literature. Dominant languages don't really ask that question, or dominant countries, about whether they have a national literature or not. So it seems more to be with the exotic and a way of touring and visiting, which perhaps might explain why you leaving out the elephants caused such distress, because it didn't fit into that notion of the exotic. So I don't know, I mean, the nation, what is it? How can it exist? There was a comment last night about South African writers in the discussion yesterday, betraying South Africa somehow, which made absolutely no sense to me. How can you betray a fantasy? An imaginary country, perhaps.
While you were talking, it popped into my head, I was thinking about, you know, if you had the idea of writing for a nation, if you had, you know, an American writer and people saying you have to be representative of the idea of the United States. And I was kind of thinking of somebody like Charles Bukowski and just imagining, you know, him on a poster with the American writer, and this is what it says about the country. Just imagining how lots of people might find that really uncomfortable.
I thought it was just like that. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree with what you're saying, but I'll try. Which is, South Africa has some specific problems, right? I mean, really, our state was always just a machine for creating and sustaining privilege, right, of whatever kind, imperial privilege, economic privilege, taking someone's labor and making it your own. Right? We inherited it. We have to, and in a strange way, it's really hard to imagine it, you know, and to think about it and argue about it. And yes, of course, none of us want to take on national duties, you know, as writers. We're far too busy, whatever. I'm not sure what we're doing, but we're busy. You know, worrying. And so it seems like a chore to have to take on the duty of thinking at a national level. But what's surprising to me is how, you know, I work at a university and you know, we read the newspapers and stuff. It's how unreal, Anjali was talking about kind of generalizations of you know, and it's how unreal most people who are supposed to think about this country in what unreal terms they think about it in, and how often writers who are just trained to pay attention to things, to language, to feelings, to events, often have the kind of sanest ways of thinking about them. And it's very hard to contribute that on an international level, right? On an international level, what are our views, really? They all converge. You know, we're opposed to global warming. We think Republicans are idiots, by and large, right? We're in favor of gay marriage. I mean, they're kind of anodyne things which can have no impact, right? But at the level of individual political communities, which South Africa is, even if it's not a national community, is the level at which people need to kind of imagine and change things. You know, I mean, it can't really work at the African Union level, or the EU level, the UN level. So if we give up national writing, don't we give up that ability to contribute to societies, to social change and so forth?
Well, there was a very interesting incident this week. Jacob Zuma had an orchid named after him by the South African National Orchid Society, and there was a whole big ceremony. I've been following Jacob Zuma on Twitter for a long time. It's the only tweet I've ever got from the presidency was about this flower arranging session just after the Marikana massacre. And I quite like that. I mean, there's a perfect novel in there if you want to take it on, Imraan, between the massacre and the orchid and the flowering thing. But I mean, one of the things about writing a national, if you take that capital N out of the national, which is perhaps the disturbing thing, best South Africa, or the most interesting South African writers to me, write with the everydayness that you were talking about, Anjali, where you capture the everyday experience and the experience of power or poverty or delight, whatever it might be, in the texture of people's lives. Perhaps that which you were talking about, Coovadia, he leaches that out, so definitely the delight gets leached out. But the specificity of how people live and how people try to have conversations with each other across these enormous gulfs and how those conversations fail. And there's so many books which attempt and capture that sort of thing, which is national in a sense that it has a small n and that it illuminates for the reader. It brings you home that different experience of how ordinary people feel things. This big N literature is so Hegelian. Big, you know what I mean? It's like the grand narrative of history.
Would you rather get rid of the capital N or the capital L?
Well, you know I don't write literature. I write those trolley books. So you know what I mean? I'm not even going to go to the literature. I just write so that people have a kind of masturbatory arc of pleasure. And it's a compensation for all the delight that was leached out by greater writers. So I'm just trying to put that back in.
Dangerous to ask Margie a question.
But,
Anjali? Thoughts?
No, I'm good, thanks.
I wanted to ask Anjali a question about nationality, because, I mean, you're English and Indian, and there seems to be so much in the sort of marketing of books and how it's that must you be an Indian English writer or an English Indian writer? I mean, don't you get caught in between what seem to be not particularly helpful categories of writing and identity? How do you navigate those two? Why must you navigate those two?
I think from the publishing point of view, Indian writing is just it's just another brand, and because a few years ago there were several Indian Booker Prize winners and stuff, I think it's just a way of selling something and suggesting that it's like other things that people probably have liked in the past. but yeah, I don't know that there's a whole difference in the way that books are sold and the way that they're written. Probably, I mean, you know, but who would affix a label like life affirming or whatever to their own novel? Probably not many people. At least one hopes not. So but I suppose it's a kind of guilty fact that you in some way collude in some of this if you allow these things to happen. I don't know how you avoid them.
Yeah, nobody's ever described anything I wrote as life affirming, but it must be. Has it ever happened to you?
No, I don't know. I don't think so.
Margie, no life affirming. No, that would be terrible. God, you'd have to retire. Yeah. I mean, there's also stuff that writers are trained to do besides do daily. I mean, one of the things that's been interesting me about South African literature or South African writing as a whole is before I kind of lost my sense of humor from working in a university. I used to think, used to kind of write comedy of a kind. And then I became really interested in kind of what does comedy mean in South Africa, right? And obviously the one thing you can't do on any South African literary platform is think about race, because everybody gets very uncomfortable. But Stephen Friedman raised this issue in Business Day a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago. He asked, why is it that we find black political figures much funnier than white ones? Like Julius Malema, okay, fine, with all his ridiculousness, right? Or Jacob Zuma, who you just mentioned, and his orchid and so forth, right? We tend to eliminate them by contempt much more quickly than we eliminate, say, F.W. de Klerk or Helen Ziller and so forth. And I'm not saying they should be eliminated either by being made figures of ridicule and so forth. But that's a particular problem to our country, right? And maybe our continent and stuff. The need to kind of to render as figures of contempt through humor certain figures in our landscape who may be better off rendered that way. But I'm not sure. I mean, is that something that matters to writers in India? Is it something you feel about newspapers in England? I don't know if that matters to anybody as a problem. But for me, it matters a lot, and increasingly is how does comedy actually work in any given situation? And I mean, as someone who's interested in comedy, my instinct is always to say, no, but let comedy be comedy. So what if that's a misogynistic, homophobic, sexist, racist joke? It's funny, right? But the second thought on that is actually, comedy is one of the ways in which ideology and hierarchy perpetuate themselves quickly, almost like a virus. And that actually unpicking comedy is an interesting, useful task. I was thinking about this Indian writer who I like, Upamanu Chatterjee. He's also a civil servant, and he wrote a book called Memories of the Welfare State, which is about this very popular civil servant character that he created in his first novel. And the first novel is very kind of charming and funny, and everyone loved it. And almost everyone has just been really angry with him since, because he hasn't reproduced the first novel in subsequent novels, even though they're actually good books. So in this novel, that person reappears, but he's quite different, and the whole novel is this Kafkaesque nightmare of people writing incredibly long memos, and at the same time doing horribly brutal things. Like there's this kind of horrible fat politician who's also raping a 14-year-old boy that he eventually kills, but still writing these ridiculous memos and negotiating endlessly to get the best possible house in the national capital, Delhi, that he can, because and people are doing ridiculous things, which are probably all taken from fact, to get allocated the best possible house, like driving around at night and seeing whether the one they like is actually occupied and whatever. So I think in his novels, the comedy works by pushing inhibitions to a point of horror, but also actually just reproducing loads and loads and loads of things in saturation that probably are just taking place. And that, that's not the vision of the country that everyone is dying to have, in a way, but it's pretty accurate, I think. Sure, yeah, absolutely. Oh.
Humor also isn't the preserve of whoever's in charge. I mean, how many dogs are there in the
Sorry,
township?
I can't hear you, Dan.
Sorry. Humor isn't the preserve of whoever's in charge. Underdogs, okay. How many dogs are there in the township who are called for vote still?
Sorry, I didn't hear it all. I'm deaf in both ears.
Humor is for everyone, Imraan.
Yeah.
It's one of the preservation strategies of all groups, minority, majority. You might hear the kind of master narrative jokes, but all groups have them. It's a way of keeping your community together, of dealing with trauma, of just being able to laugh at, because it's the last thing you have. when everything else is taken away from you.
Absolutely.
Like preserving your identity.
I'd love to agree with you, because it would make me feel a lot better, and I'd be able to laugh at my troubles. There is actually new sociology of humor, which is interesting but not funny. And one of the most interesting studies I read was a study of a mental hospital, and they looked, a sociologist went and looked at the jokes, right, that were being told. Invariably, the jokes go from the top downwards. So the consulting psychiatrist told the most number of jokes. People laughed the longest, independent of quality. I mean, they didn't have a good, right? And those jokes were generally told at the expense of junior consultants or the patients, right? Junior consultants told jokes about the patients, right? On average, people laughed a little less long than for the senior consultants, right? And the patients didn't tell jokes at all because they were crazy, right? But there's a kind of privilege in humor itself, I think. And yes, humor is a coping strategy, humor is wonderful and stuff, but humor is also, I think, the single deadliest piece of kind of politics that you can use. And I mean, I went to boarding school in South Africa in the 1970s, and the one thing I have nightmares about is the kind of jokes the boys used to tell. I've blotted them out, kind of, and they only come back in my nightmares. But they were jokes which are about fixing people in place and holding them there as objects of contempt. I've been thinking about this since I read a really interesting book called The Moral History of Humanity by a guy at the LSE, I think. And he gives a whole chapter about cold jokes, which are jokes where you kind of, he talks about kind of when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, and they killed a boy, and then they charged his family for the price of the grave, or the bullets, sorry. And he gave that as an example of a cold joke. And I think, there's a way in which, just in the same way that literature isn't necessarily innocent, humor isn't always as innocent as we want it to be. And at least thinking about that, I think, has been part of my thinking about what literature does, anyway. But I mean, I know this is a sort of sidetrack, but it was on my mind. I'll try and laugh more. We'll both try and laugh more.
Question.
Damon, that's impossible.
No.
I have all the stupid questions today.
You both, at the outset, set aside any possibility that there is such a thing as a national literature and have given it very short shrift. But then, Imraan, you raised this notion of an international style. Surely, by implication, that means there is such a thing as a national style. And isn't that something that might characterize a national literature?
I think it's a really good point. I don't know enough architecture to know how you distinguish between kind of vernacular building styles or indigenous building styles and international styles. I don't know if it's fair to say that you could ever have a national writing style or so forth. I mean, what would it mean in South Africa where we read books from everywhere and have television and the internet from everywhere to have a national style? What you can have are periods of kind of unique cultural intensity and excitement. I mean, obviously Russia between 1860 and 1910 is one of those places, right? Victorian England or Romanticist England between, say, 1790 and 1870 is one of those extraordinary things. And I think that's, if we talk about national literature, for me, it's that I want. Like, not one style for everybody or one set of thoughts or commandments, but a kind of whole series of arguments, Margie's, arguments about different kinds of genre and your own kind of ways of rethinking what narrative structure is and what the sentence looks like and what identity is, alongside all the other things. And to me, that's the hope of national literature, is at least a kind of a shape in which you pay attention to other people, or maybe like a circus tent in which people look at the other performers in the circus tent. I don't think we can actually have a national style anymore. I don't know if who you see yourself as in the same space with, Anjali.
I think it varies, but there are probably, with each thing that you're working on, there are probably certain things that you read and reread. Right. I don't know, and it probably seemed terribly pretentious to say, but I like the idea of specific sets of arguments that might be important. If I think about Indian literature at what I know of it at the kind of turn of the 20th century or the end of the 19th century, then that would be one of the things that that you could say that, you know, certain questions like should we be writing in English, should we write in our mother tongues? If we're writing in our mother tongues, should we use a less literary version of the language than people have hitherto used for writing? Should we kind of make it more demotic? How should we do it? Should we write short stories or epic poems? Or, you know, should we talk about the independence struggle overtly the whole time? Or should we just write observational short stories? I think those are kind of, that's a sign of a vibrant intellectual culture, I suppose. But then, you know, even that stipulation is kind of annoying in a way, maybe. I don't know.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think any kinds of commands. Sipiwa? Or, sorry, people have had their hands up everywhere. You've had your hand up for ages.
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting that you've, as Damon said, you've cast aside the question really, you've given it such short shrift. And it seems to me that it may be that you're looking at this from the point of view of writers who don't want to be writing in a national style, and I can completely understand that. However, to pick up on a point that Margie made, there's this question about how a nation, a growing nation, defines itself. And Margie, I think, was right in suggesting that as a nation moves towards independence, there's a question of what defines a nation. But I think it goes beyond that. And the point I want to make is that America, USA, has been gripped by this notion of the great American novel. You know, 250 years after it became independent, America is still obsessed with trying to get the great American novel. And although Jonathan Franzen may well not be wanting to try to write the great American novel, the media certainly want him to be, him and people like him to be writing a novel which describes the States today. So I'd like to ask you whether you can think about, not about how it feels to be a writer writing, but how your work is received by the media and by governments and put out into the world as if it were a national literature.
I don't know, because I don't think it's even always put out as though it were a national literature. It's just put out. I think the idea of a brand is more relevant. I think it's put out, you know, so often, for example, books, at least in England, I don't know if it happens here, but I would imagine that it does. For example, there was Captain Corelli's Mandolin some years ago in England. That book sold like crazy. And then straight after that, there were other books set on Greek islands which had very, very similar covers using, you know, Greek tile motifs. And there was a clear attempt by the publishers to kind of say, it's quite like that book that you really like, just buy this book. And I think that happens more in the way that books are sold, rather than necessarily characterizing something as seriously as, you know, national literature in any sense. I mean, as a question to the audience, how much do you want to read? And it's not a kind of directed question. How much do you want to read in national categories? I mean, does that interest you? Is it, for example, do you feel that it's fruitful to read South African literature from the 19th century and be aware of the kind of historical context, or I don't know, Chilean literature and be aware of the historical context in a certain period? Is that something that does interest you?
I actually had a question I wanted to ask us. I'm not actually going to respond to your question. But I must say, I in part share this distrust that some of the other audience members have at a too ready brushing aside of the question of national literature. I mean, one of the really interesting things about this book festival is the way that it brings writers from all over the world, you know, around a single table. And here you're sitting next to Imraan Coovadia. Last night, I got to see you in a very interesting panel of 5 writers, and one was based in Cape Town, one, I think, it lives in Nigeria, one is an American writer, one was from Haiti. And what was really interesting there is very interesting writers and very, different kinds of projects. At certain times, a conversation broke out around political issues or whatever, and people had an exchange of ideas. But when you guys actually started reading from your work, what was really obvious was just how different it is. Different in tone, different in rhythm, different in syntax. And I suspect that that goes beyond merely individual difference. You're different writers, you're different people, you have different interests. I suspect that, I think it was clear that you also emerge from different traditions, right? And you're in conversation with different traditions of writing, I think, inevitably to some extent. And to some extent, there must be national traditions of writing. I guess I want to ask you to think about this maybe in terms of something like a tradition. I mean, clearly there must be different national traditions of writing, but one of the things that may mean is that certain prior figures are unavoidable to you by virtue of being South African or Indian or British in a way they may not be unavoidable for other people. I mean, Imraan, you seem harassed by J.M. Coetzee in a way that maybe Irish writers wouldn't be, or perhaps the same is true for you of someone, Rushdie or someone, who's just unavoidable there in a way that he may not be for, I don't know, a Chinese writer. So I wonder if that's not just a question of choice, but also just of the resources at your disposal and the people you can't avoid. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts of that.
There might be two questions. One is in terms of the education that you get as a young person, and in that sense, I would imagine it is unavoidable to come into contact with people in your national tradition, naturally. But I mean, that's not, at least I was trying to make the argument that I don't think that most of us read in national boundaries. And so, yes, you might read, you know, Salman Rushdie or whatever, but there'd be so many other people available to you, and maybe you wouldn't read, as an Indian, you wouldn't read Indian writers until you were much older, or maybe, you know, maybe you'd be obsessed with South American writers or Japanese writers. It can happen. So I think the idea of a tradition is completely valid, but I also think there's a lot of constructing your own tradition based on what strikes a chord with you, and I don't know if that generally happens in, I don't think it's wrong if it happens in national lines, I just don't think it should be assumed that it will.
I mean, the concept of the tradition is a bit like, it's like the magic spell in the what's it, the magic arrow in the quiver of every critic, because it lets you read each text in terms of other ones. But there's also the views that literature itself has about society and nation states. I mean, if you read Damon's last book, I mean, whether it's his last book in terms of his thinking or not is another question. What happens there? You know, there's no real society in that book. I mean, putting myself in danger of being contradicting by the author, but it's basically people you bump into or collide with and so forth. And there's much less of a sense of kind of a background or history with many of those characters. And I wonder if, you know, in that sense, South Africa might be tending entirely away from nation or tradition into a kind of society of a set of expatriate groups, you know, kind of privileged expatriate groups, the same way that if you go to Nairobi, there's a kind of class of people who have Land Rovers and in a sense have separated themselves entirely from that community. In a sense, maybe the characters in Margie's novels too are linked by kind of arbitrary accident, interest, exploitation, but not by whatever common feeling or inheritance you think of as part of a nation or community. So we may be in a worse or better situation than other national literatures. Sabir?
Yeah, as South Africans, we are often confronted with, actually people often prescribe to say, you guys are not writing about this and that. And I need to hear your opinion about that, because from where I'm sitting, like, there are so many issues in South Africa. Like, on the one hand, people are talking about the killing of the rhino. And on the other, people are more down in Marikana, you know. So South Africa, our predecessors, especially having been part of the liberation movement, we are always expected to, there's a certain level of activism that is expected from us. One of the recent issues, for instance, while we are dealing with the situation of the textbook saga in Limpopo, there was a huge march about the president's spear. At some point, actually, one of the leaders of the unions threatened to march, to have an all-men march, and they were going to be naked because they were protesting against the painting of the spear. So I want to know from you, both of you guys, what do you see as the key responsibility of a writer today? Thank you.
Do you want to say something about the spear? I don't know if you know about the painting of the spear.
Yeah, I think I have Margie. Yeah, Margie did tell me.
Well, the president's manhood was a national issue. Okay.
Go for it.
I think that if everybody is Imraan used the phrase paying attention earlier. I think if people are paying attention to what's around them, whatever aspect of that interests them and writing authentically about it, there will be a really great national literature. But I think the idea of imposing it from the top down in a cookie cutter way and saying this is South African, this is not South African, isn't going to do it. And also, some of the things that you're talking about, for example, these are news events and they have news value and they're interesting, but it takes time to write a novel, and maybe a better novel would be written, in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. It wouldn't necessarily have the sort of marketing value of being rushed out now about, a national leader whose manhood is impugned in a painting or whatever. But that I think to expect art to do what the media does presently and respond to things on a kind of immediate basis is not really getting it to do what it does best.
I agree. I mean, I was, it wasn't about the spear painting, but I was on a panel, I ran a panel with Zapiro, the cartoonist, who, obviously is being sued by the president for depicting him in a certain way, kind of very negatively, or depicting him raping the body of law, and Albie Sachs, the former constitutional court judge. And Albie said very controversially, but I think rightly, that in a sense what Anjali is saying is what we all have to do, which is we have immediate reflexes, right, about freedom of expression, and humor is one of those immediate reflexes and so forth. But there's a kind of, the way in which that spear painting worked out, and the kinds of ways in which it played on our feelings and stuff, and the way in which kind of some of Zapiro's cartoons worked out, at least it's writers are good at thinking about the complexities of those reflexes, and the ways in which we want to kind of rush in and agree, yes, the president is a buffoon, or and so forth, without worrying about kind of all the dark feelings that go into it, or complicated or quite distressing feelings. And I think kind of hesitating a little before we rush in and positing those things as things that we might be interested in examining is one of the tasks of a not popular literature. I think popular literature makes you feel politicians are evil and corrupt. There are some good policemen, and beautiful women are complicated, right? That's roughly that return trolley at the library is full of that kind of popular literature, right? Relatively unpopular literature is about suspending those immediate reflexes and asking what enters into them. And I think to the extent that our literature, if it's a South African literature or national literature, has some validity, it's about kind of pulling back from some of those immediate things and maybe thinking, okay, yeah, it's really fun, the spear thing is wonderful, we can feel very indignant about freedom of expression being violated and so forth, but are there other things going on in that painting, and is there something strange about our fascination with it? And I think that might be a contribution of writers, at the same time as we should defend freedom of expression and imagination. Other thoughts? Sorry. If anybody's waited too long, just kind of shake your hand, but otherwise, Lizzie?
Is this working? Yeah. Hi. One of the things Imraan will know about me is I once went in pursuit of national literatures in South Africa and Zimbabwe.
Did you find them?
That were writing about HIV, and of course PhDs become redundant after you've written them. And I discovered obviously that you couldn't reduce the nation, either of the two nations, to a kind of allegory about death and loss and mourning and melancholy, as much as you try when you're an academic. I think the thing I want to say about that is that whenever I've spoken to writers directly and interviewed them, for example, someone like Charles Mungoshi in Zimbabwe, who's much neglected, a brilliant storyteller, we ended up having a conversation where he referenced everything from Sufism to quantum physics to a song his grandfather sang him, which I couldn't understand, to the power cut that occurred during our conversation, which I had to delete from my tape. And not record in the interview that I published. And it was just the most extraordinary collection of ideas and reflections. And he did come from a tradition, a particular one. It was so nuanced, the Shona, that he spoke from such a particular area where he'd grown up. It then became something, the words failed me. I couldn't have interpreted that in any other way. And the only thing you can then do is read the stories that he had written. And some of those contain aids and some of them don't, and yeah, that was something that struck me. The more you speak to writers and the more you read their work, people circle issues, loss, and skirt around them, but they don't always speak directly, and those are the ones which stay with you, I think.
Absolutely.
The novelist R.K. Narayan, who I really love, an Indian novelist, he grew up in a small town and lived there basically all of his life. And he said that you can't be a writer unless you have lived in a place all your life and you have that kind of immersion in it. And I think he has a similar kind of emotional directness that's really beautiful. But I don't think I was trying to say that that writers should be dislocated or that place isn't incredibly important or specificity isn't incredibly important. I think of it more like, as an analogy, if there were a family with lots of children, you know, and one version of this family said, we've always been lawyers and you should be a lawyer and this is the kind of thing you should do and you should play rugby and cricket and belong to the country club or whatever. And all of the children sort of had to do that, otherwise they'd be accused of not being sufficiently, you know, familial. And then imagine another kind of family where actually everybody did different things, and some of those things seem quite bizarre even. But everyone was kind of celebrated, and all of the products of whatever they did was sort of kept in the house, and it was seen as a good thing. I think you could have a national literature that is about celebration and isn't threatened by the possibility of people representing even things that don't seem like good PR. And that is what all the great writers have done. You know, I mean, in India, our only Nobel laureate, Rabindranath Tagore, actually wrote endless, very modernist short stories about poverty and caste injustice and the way that widows were treated, and, you know, all kinds of things that just weren't, they weren't representing the country, if you like, in a sort of good light, depending on what you mean by a good light, but they weren't saying everything's great. So, but, you know, he's a great writer, but now the way that he's seen is this kind of sort of deified figure with a big white beard and, you know, spouting about universal love or whatever. It's not necessarily exactly what his artistic project was, perhaps. But I just dislike the idea that there would be an encouragement to writers to be representing things well. For example, also, I mean, and I'm not necessarily saying it's on a par with Tagore, but when the film Slumdog Millionaire came out, in India, lots of people were very angry because they said this is portraying the country badly. And I haven't seen the film, I'm not even that interested in the film, but it was bizarre because you thought, but, you know, lots of these things are happening. Or a few years ago, I remember a famous film actress being quoted in the newspaper in Bombay saying, people think that in India, you know, cows are walking around on the streets, but that doesn't happen in Bombay. And I left my office, went outside, and there was actually a cow at a massive traffic junction. And amazingly, the cow observed lane protocol and kind of went to the middle of the road and then turned right. But, but, you know, you sort of thought, but I've just seen it, and it's in the middle of town. So that doesn't mean that that's all there is. It's a very sophisticated city, but these things are there as well. And I just feel that if a certain notion of a national literature is upheld, then it can restrict that diversity.
How are we doing for time? We have about 10 more minutes.
I mean, an interesting, or perhaps a more productive way of thinking of a national literature is, or for me as a writer, is the paradox between South African writers and readers, which I think someone asked about people reading here. I mean, I've never had any interest about writing books in another place. I lived in the States, I've lived in England. I have no interest in writing books about those places, unless you write one of those sort of lost, wandering, you know, how to find your way around. There's absolutely nothing which connects with the thing in me that makes me write and try to understand the place. Whereas in South Africa, the compulsion is to try to understand why South Africa is so violent and so kind at the same time. That gulf between the two and how you mesh them. So there is something that draws one to the place in which you are born and formed and shaped, which is not really to do with nationalism, but to do with returning, you know, that Freud's idea of the return to that repressed all the time, to try and bring it out and to understand it. But the other thing you have in a national literature, perhaps a place, is a historical conversation of novels and writers, which is not just the great tradition, but, I mean, for instance, South Africa is cursed with a farm novel, which I blame Olive Schreiner. And nothing happens on farms. Anyone who's been to a farm knows that nothing happens there, but we've had this endless repeat of this farm novel, the farm novel. So any novel you write, in a way, is a countering this evil tradition of the farm novel. you know, so if you, I mean, the interesting part of South Africa in many ways is the urban texture, but that has to exist in the national conversation, the books that have been written about this place in relation to those bloody farms, you know, which everybody's left. So, you know, you do get a kind of a curse that you have to do, but one of the paradoxes, what I want to say about readers, and this goes back to what you were saying, Imraan, about comedy, perhaps. Because you wrote a comic novel and then you came back to South Africa and stopped writing comedy. But one of the things that you have to persuade South African readers is to buy South African novels.
It's still meant to be comedy, it's just you didn't find it amusing.
But is to buy South African books and you know, and to read them. And it's, I mean, a lot of us write terrible novels, that's true, but not everybody does. But there's this resistance, which I think is part of is very much a South African thing of not a refusal, a blindness to the reality of what we've lived with.
I absolutely agree. In fact, I mean, some of the audience members have noted kind of the way we dispatch the issue of national literature, but I'm very sympathetic to it, if only on, shall we say, tactical grounds, right? Firstly, I think life throws up situations that are more complicated than you can really dream up as a writer, constantly, you know, in this country as elsewhere. Secondly, I feel that even a country as fractured and ahistorical as this one has all sorts of fascinating micro-traditions that, in a sense, can make up the most interesting part of literature. Think about the traditions we have in Cape Town, right? On the full moon, from my old apartment, you could see the kind of lights going up around Lion's Head because people would climb it, right? On the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, Malay women cut up orange leaves to create little parcels to kind of celebrate. And that's specific Indonesian Islam descended to South Africa by complicated ways. There are the broken traditions. In my last book, I used a poem which was translated from the Shona by Douglas Livingstone, who is the kind of great but quite reactionary marine biologist poet from Durban, and he had translated a kind of a love poem from Shona, which went something like, you know, love is like a mealie cob that has to be fried in the frying pan of acquaintance or something. You know, it's like a beautiful. But I love the idea that here was the kind of the Shona folk poem picked up by a kind of reactionary poet in Durban in the 1970s and kind of conveyed to me for some reason. You know, in the same way that those kind of Bleak and Lloyd, we have this kind of wonderful archive of San culture and language. You know, it's passed through so many hands. My kind of great colleague Pippa Skodnes is really involved with the way that archive and those fragments of language and feeling have been kind of passed on and through all these unexpected hands, you know, German academics and kind of prisons and mission stations and the University of Cape Town and so forth, and my late colleague Stephen Watson, who translated them, and Ike Krach, who translated them and so forth. I think, you know, to give up on both our real traditions, our micro-traditions, and our kind of broken ones or ones that have passed through all sorts of hands is to give away a whole lot of what you have of your richness as a writer. And I'm surprised at how quickly we kind of give it away. You know? And I think to some extent the international style and Coetsianism and stuff gives all that away. And I don't know what did they get in return, you know, except for a feeling that they're on the intellectual cutting edge of structuralism or post-structuralism or whatever essentially half-baked theory that they're in pursuit of. You know? I would rather have the nation than that. Right? And maybe I'd rather not have a nation at all, but I'd rather have it to post-structuralism as a kind of object of interest. Should we have one last or two last questions?
Is it on? Okay. I'm Frances Galloway. I would just like to suggest something. You know, for decades we had this debate around South African literature, which can maybe be the same as a national literature. And we even have the latest Cambridge University Press publication on South African literature, which I still think is not really a very good presentation or story about what I call the book in South Africa. And I really cannot understand why we don't focus more on the history of the book in this country. Because then we won't have all these problems with, what about 11 languages? How can we write a history, South African literature, with 11 languages. You have to have so many people working on it, etc., etc. I mean, let's look at the story of the book, how books were read, who read them, where they came from, where were they printed, how did they get here, who started to create and disseminate and print books in South Africa. Then we will also have people more interested in the book in South Africa. Because at the moment we still have this English South African literature thing. And I really think it's becoming late in the day. And if academics, I mean, there are wonderful people like Professor Archie Dick, Andrew van der Vlies talked this morning about their books on text and print and culture. But there were only a handful of people in that session. And I think that is the thing we have to look at. What is the history of the book in South Africa?
Look, for myself, I think that's a completely great move. I think the turn to book history, to understanding who is reading what, who is underlining what, to what extent kind of the most unexpected books ended up in the most unexpected hands, I think that's a really progressive turn. And I think any turn away from the kind of arid international style and international theory towards specifically what happens here is fascinating. Isabel Hofmeyr is one of the great thinkers in this, and there's sometimes when, you know, as a writer you see academics as adversaries, you know, or just kind of off on their strange projects. Sometimes when you see them as allies and as people who are helping you think about the world, and people like Isabel Hofmeyr, and I haven't read Andrew van der Vlies's collection yet, but that strikes me as exactly the right direction we should be going in. I mean, I endorse it entirely. I don't know what you feel about the history of the book. And
I was just thinking when you were saying that anthologies are one of the things that I feel good about in terms of national literature, as long as there are many of them and they're quite various in a way. Yeah.
No, absolutely. In fact, one of my former colleagues has just been writing about the anthology, Leah Price, and the kind of the way in which the anthology works. And I think
I mean, the anthology can be very prescriptive or political or boring as well. But you know, if there are lots and lots and lots of anthologies, it's a great thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let 100 flowers bloom, as Chairman Mao would say. I think we only have one more question. You had your hand up for a while. Sorry.
I just want to ask Anjali, because I think your response to how your book was received in India kind of begs the question on the relevance or non-relevance of a national literature. I mean, your book has been acknowledged and celebrated and well received in the West. And I'm not sure if, well, it's a question, has the response in India disappointed you? Because I get a sense that, I mean, your response to that was, you know, you don't get it. You know, their response is just that, you know, we don't need our lives kind of spat back at us. And so that's been the reaction to your book. And I mean, there is the culture. If you look at Bollywood film in India, it's all about fantasy. I mean, people are not, you know, running on snow-capped mountains in Banaras saris and the next minute swimming in a lake, you know, and change clothes 20 times a day. But that's why people go to the cinema in India, because it's escapism. It's about the fantasy. It's about running away from their depressed, you know, economically depraved lives. And I'm trying to understand that maybe that is partly the response. You know, so when Imraan says that he now kind of is embracing the word context a little bit more, maybe that is the thing with your book, is that contextually in India, you know, it resonates, but the fact that it resonates is maybe just a little bit too much or too painful. It's a question.
I think I mean, I think there are different specific audiences for certain things, and I don't think that I really hope not. That'd be awful. I don't think that any economically depressed kind of, or, you know, morally depressed people who wanted escapism and a cinema ticket got my book by accident. That would be really cruel. But I also actually, I mean, that's a representation of India. Of course, you know, Bollywood films and all the other national language films, which are also huge in the South and other parts of the country, do offer escapism and music and dance. But there are lots of other types of films and lots of other types of books, and there are, you know, writers in Bengali or Malayalam or all kinds of other Indian languages who are writing very, very depressing literature, sometimes very social realist, very good literature, among other genres. and those do well. So I don't think that was the point. And it was a kind of relatively light-hearted point. And also the people who were making that response were book reviewers. You know, they weren't people, at least arguably, they weren't people who because of leading factually difficult lives needed, at least maybe I'm wrong, but needed a sort of injection of hope and optimism from what they were reading. Or that's not the job description anyway. Context, yeah, maybe it is partly to do with that, but I don't think, in the end, I mean, for example, the book won a national prize that was awarded by Indian writers. So if they had felt that it was completely unreal and didn't engage with what they felt was an authentic strand of life in India, maybe they wouldn't have given it the prize. But I think it's easy to oversimplify, especially from the outside, but worryingly sometimes from the inside too. And that's what worries me about the idea of a national literature, perhaps. So if a national literature is going to say, but you know, we need more books set in townships about difficult relationships between a black man and a white woman, why should I read In a Strange Room? I just think that's the wrong question. And that's kind of the idea of a national literature that worries me. Whereas if it's saying, I've read, you know, all of these books, but I'm still more interested in the one set in the township, you kind of think, fair enough, that's your prerogative. I just dislike the idea that certain things would be left out of the mainstream discourse because they don't appear to fit the national project, maybe.
I mean, I have to say for myself, I'm really encouraged by what you say, because I've never been able to watch a Bollywood movie, and I always thought, why don't they just watch Satyajit Ray movies in India? And it turns out I'm actually too happy, so, you know, I don't need to escape into Bollywood movies. I thought it was too assimilated. I just wanted to thank Anjali and you as the audience for the most unexpectedly not simple conversation and set of arguments I've sat through in many months. Thank you so much, Anjali.
Well, thank you all for coming. Yeah.
I don't know if I clap. Maybe I shouldn't clap. It's sort of silly.
From our side, thank you very much to Anjali as well for, I think, a very thought-provoking paper, and for your participation over the last 2 hours, and to Imraan as well. This does draw to a close the portion of Open Book, which has seen this partnership with the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the British Council on the 50th anniversary edition of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference. I am not going to be stupid enough to attempt to sum up this session or any of them, but I think that the discussions that people have been having after the sessions, I think, illustrate how stimulating people have found them. And I want to firstly just say a big thank you to all those who have participated in the 3 different events and kind of brought a commitment to the process, which I think has been absolutely wonderful and very, very valuable. And I think the nature of these discussions is anything but linear, both while you're in the discussion, but also where it goes afterwards. And I think that there are a lot of people who have got a lot of very, very interesting thoughts going around in their head, which are going to permeate for the next while. I would also urge you to keep an eye on the EWWC website and keep in touch with the discussions that, like this, which continue around the world in the other 12 countries that are going to host these conversations, which will, of course, then culminate in Edinburgh in August next year. So thank you very, very much to the British Council for their role in putting this together, and, of course, to Nick Barley and the team at the Edinburgh Book Festival for, I think, having this fantastic idea. And I think that this the impact of what has happened so far and what is going to continue to happen for the rest of this year, 12-month year as opposed to calendar year, I think is going to be felt for a long, long time. I also just need to once again say a very big thank you to Leopard Sleep, our headline sponsors in Open Book, who have once again demonstrated their sterling commitment to promoting South African literature, and they do a wonderful job. And thanks again to all of you for participating. Open Book has another 2.5 days to go. In half an hour's time, we're going to be doing a bilingual launch of Andre Brink's new novel, For Leader, which is going to be happening here. The reason I'm telling you that is that you all need to get out of here very quickly so we can prepare the venue. Thank you very much.